One, congratulations for climbing up 10 floors after a heavy lunch, I'm sure, right? So welcome to our panel discussion. The overarching theme for today's panel discussion is exploring the contemporary relevance of Gandhian economics. We have three distinguished panelists here who would kick off the discussion on related themes. And then we're really looking forward to a very interactive question-answer session with the audience and a discussion within the panelists on some of the ideas that are thrown up. So that's the plan for today's afternoon. I'm sure all of you have already seen our email invite, where I have shared with you the profile of the panelists as well as the substance or the abstract of some of the issues that they're going to be touching upon in their presentations. So I'm not going to stand between you and them for any more time. Just to set the context, I guess, the context was set long back when a gentleman called Mr. J.C. Kumarappa, who many of you have heard about, had to walk out of the first ever Planning Commission meeting in the pre-independence days, simply because he was the only Gandhian voice in that group, and he was significantly outnumbered by the Nehruvians in that commission. And that, in a sense, set the context for what we know as today's modern economic blueprint of an emphasis on promoting infant, heavy industry, and modern science and technology, and all the rest of the story that I'm sure you'll have heard ad nauseum in your classes. So in today's times, we have clearly moved from that view of Indian economic development to what is almost ludicrous, which is to say that we are leveraging no longer on Gandhian's ideas of leveraging local resources through the local population and local knowledge to serve local markets and look at both local production and consumption, but the exact opposite of that, an idea that's probably light years away from this summarized Gandhian sort of perspective, to a head of state who's talking about building a $5 trillion economy today in India, largely on the basis of leveraging global capital, the global diaspora for global markets, and to serve global consumption. Okay? So the journey has been long. The journey has gone all over the place. And why are we even talking about Gandhian economics and its relevance? Abundantly clear, because some of the consequences of some of these choices that we've made in the past are also becoming completely evident to everybody who's living on the planet today, whether it's in terms of ecological degradation, in terms of a mindless consumerism that affects both the psychological and physiological health of human beings, or any others that, again, you're aware of. So that's it from me. Why are we having this discussion today? I think it's important to relook at Gandhian economics and tease out what makes sense in today's times, and again, in the spirit of Gandhi, not just talk ideas, but also look at how do we translate them into action in a world that is not particularly kind to Gandhian thoughts on economics as we speak, right? So with that, I'll hand it over to our first panelist, Mr. Venu Madhav Govindu, from the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. And his presentation will be followed by a presentation by Rajni Bakshi, who's an author and columnist and has published a lot of books. I've shared her bio with you. And then our very own Professor Amit Basole of the Azim Premji University. And all of them will be teasing out different aspects of Gandhian economic thought. And then, as I said, we'll have an open discussion. So over to you, Venu. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Control L, Madi. The purpose for which we are here today, and thank you all for firstly having Rajni, and I suppose you don't have to get Amit to, invite Amit to be here, but nevertheless, yeah, we are all happy to be here. Gandhi 150 has been a busy time for a lot of people like us writing articles and wondering whether they really mean much. And there's been a lot of we keep sort of revisiting the same questions, right? I mean, these are questions that were animating the debates in the Gandhian era, and they unfortunately are still very much alive, if not even in a more acute sense today. Which is why, I mean, looking at the historical context, makes a lot of sense. In my talk today, I mean, although I'm neither, so just sort of full disclosure, I'm neither an economist nor a historian, yeah? And so if you're wondering what I'm doing here, you got to blame the organizers for inviting me, right? So, okay. So, but nevertheless, I've been very interested in this whole question of what is this beast called Gandhian economics. And I'm particularly pleased that you guys have chosen to talk about it, because Gandhi has touched upon many different aspects of life. He's generated a lot of interest, a lot of controversy, and the debates are unending. But actually, Gandhian economics has not really had its day under the sun, both in practice, in terms of the policy decisions that the Indian state makes, or in terms of how we perceive it. And I think increasingly there is an awareness, there is a certain discomfiture with the way things are in the world today. And hopefully we can tie in through, what I will say and what will be followed up by Rajni and Amit, to see why many of these ideas that had a particular historical specificity to them, right? They arose out of a certain historical juncture, but clearly there are things that go beyond that particular point in time and space, right? So they are increasingly, we find that there is a lot of things that one can mine to try and recognize what the issues are. Okay, so quickly, the person, this is J.C. Kumarappa. And this picture is in 1939 at the inauguration of the Magan Sangralaya. Okay, so anyway, so I wanted to talk about, situate Kumarappa's particular contributions in the larger arc of Gandhian economics, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of limit myself to some salient aspects of what he had to say in terms of what an economy should look like, or what are the attributes of an economy. I should point out that many of the questions that you will find posed in my presentation may seem like commonplace today, in the sense that there's been a lot of pushback against what may constitute mainstream economics for a while, although we have not had the political impetus to shift policy or the direction societies go in. But nevertheless, there's been a lot of interest, both within the community of economists, right, who are looking at it in different senses, like heterodox schools and so on and so forth. So all of that, some of it you might find resonance with what's going on now, but please keep in mind that these questions were being raised by Gandhi and Kumarappa in the 20s, and Kumarappa in particular in the 30s and 40s, where they were really not in the public discourse, right? So you should keep that in mind in terms of trying to recognize how far ahead they were in their times or not, in those terms. Okay, so just to give you a very sort of rudimentary sketch of what is the historical context within which all of this originates, there's been this whole, Indian nationalism in particular is very special in the sense that it very early on it brought an economic critique of colonialism, right? That was not, that was special about, say, people like Nauroji and R. Siddharth and others, right? So and then, you have the whole business of economic sojourn and the debates on deindustrialization of India. Gandhi sort of enters the public discourse somewhere here, and then he is very particular about reconstituting agrarian India. And please keep in mind, when he's talking about reconstitution, despite, Gandhi is much talked about, but I would say in many senses he's also much misunderstood. Part of it has got to do with the vocabulary that he brings to bear, but part of it has got to simply to do with the fact that people, he's extremely radical in the sense that he poses some fundamental questions, and there's been a lot of resistance to those ideas, right? The axiomatic questions that he asks. So therefore, we will find that. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that when we talk about reconstituting, it is not really going back to some ancient past. He's asking the question, what is the nature of society that we want to build, right? For Gandhi, economics and society are not to be distinguished, but for our purposes, we will make that distinction. So you could ask the question, you could pose this whole argument that we are having today is to go back to the fundamentals and ask, what is an economy for? What is the objective and what is the purpose of an economy, right? And then we will try and see what the specific answer that they had in their time. In particular, we should also keep in mind that Gandhi was a preeminent leader of the Congress, but in these matters, there was a very great divergence of thought on that, right? And so there is this whole specific focus that he has on Khadi in the 20s, and that leads to the particular historical context of 1930s, where all of these political events happen, right? Dandi Roundtable Conference, and then the second phase of civil disobedience collapses in 33. It's a period of great strife. But actually, the substrate of that is defined by the impact of the Great Depression in India at that time. Yeah, Great Depression had already arrived on Indian shores by late 1932. Its impact was quite clear. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I'll be happy to talk about that offline. So Gandhi chooses to retire from the Congress because he says that the needs of village India cannot wait anymore. We're going to talk about this political struggle against the British, but we can't just wait for things to happen because the rural India is crying out for redress, right? That's the context in which he appears. And so as a sort of simplified representation, the Congress was critical of colonialism, but Congress and intelligentsia in India was critical of the colonial system, but it accepted the idea of large-scale industrialization and growth. And that's the fundamental difference that distinguishes them from Gandhi, and his focus is really got to do with the various forms of autonomy or freedom, if you will, that are to be obtained in society, right? That's really the question that he's asking. So it's a rather unusual way of approaching this notion of individual freedom, if you will. It is not the Western individual libertarian kind of approach, but it's a very different, nuanced approach which takes into account the context in which we are living in. So Gandhi was persistently challenged, saying, are you going to take us back to the village? Right? I mean, that's the question that was thrown at him by very important figures in his time. And his answer was very clear. He actually said, the economic exploitation of the village is nothing but organized violence. These are his exact quotes, right? He uses the phrase organized violence, and we can all see what that implies. And you can see the implications of that playing out in Indian countryside right now, right, as we speak, with the unending agrarian crisis that we are in. Okay? So Gandhi says, you don't have to do anything else but render unto the village what it's due. And that's where the problem lies, right? I mean, the moment you start asking the questions, how do we do justice to the economic order in the countryside, then a whole number of questions will have to arise. And his focus, in an abstracted sense, was on equity, building a more egalitarian economic system for our purposes now, and therefore economic justice, but also the question of creative freedom. It's very important because even today, you find all of us urban residents, we are significantly better off than many other, millions of people in this country. But if you ask the question, do we have the creative freedom to live out our lives in the fullest sense that we would like to? Maybe not. Then there are questions that arise as to what is the nature of the social and economic order that we inhabit, right? I mean, so that's the context in which they're very particularly keen on these aspects. These are abstract ideas. These are abstract ideal goals. It doesn't mean that you're going to get there in a hurry, but nevertheless, you're not going to. Gandhi's point was that you shouldn't lose sight of what these ideas represent. And in particular, Kumarappa enters the discourse essentially, well, he joins Gandhi in 1929, but let's say in the 30s he enters the discourse and he inflects it with a lot of meaning. Just as a brief aside, I've co-authored a biography of Kumarappa, but this is like a telegraphic version of that, right? So, but just as a brief aside, I mean, he joins Gandhi in 1929 with training in economics and accountancy and so on and so forth. So he has the technical sort of prowess to be able to parse the questions in the economic realm with the Gandhian lens and the Gandhian framework in mind, right? So he emerges as a critic of large-scale industrialization and commodification, and is known and was vehemently criticized and opposed because of his championing of the agrarian economy in his lifetime. And of course, he was a proponent of village industries. What is very interesting is also the fact that a certain environmental ethic arises naturally out of the specific economic vision that he presents, right? I'm not going to dwell on the environmental dimension much, but we should keep that in mind. And these are two well-known books of his, but he's written extensively. So Kumarappa essentially looks at the economy as essentially, there's no real clear distinction between what is an economic question and what is a question to do with your philosophical outlook towards life, right? And it's not to duck the technical questions that are involved, but they are very mindful of the framework within which they're operating. So the point that he makes is if there's anything that characterizes Gandhiji's life, it's his devotion to truth and nonviolence. Any economy that is associated with name should therefore answer to these fundamental principles. Now, of course, it's easy and nice to say that. It's not quite clear how to translate that into principles, if you will, of economic analysis, right? And that's what he spends a whole lifetime sort of doing. And in particular, Kumarappa brings in a very clear understanding of what colonial economic history tells us, because the assumption of a lot of nationalist leaders, we heard the Nehruvian term used a little while ago. The assumption, these are all well-meaning stalwarts of our freedom movement, right? But they were still, and they could see all the crises of poverty around in the country and so on and so forth. So we should not, we should emphasize that point. It is just that they had a particularly different understanding of where the remedy lies. And perhaps then we should ask, where has it landed us, right? Where has that remedy landed us today? Yeah. So, but let's try and understand the context in which they were operating in. And so this is where the prescience of the Gandhian framing of the question becomes important, right? It never really got acceptance in its time or even today, right? In a wider sense. But the questions that it poses are very much alive in our economic order. So one of the fundamental contributions that Kumarappa makes is he emphasizes this notion of local production for local consumption. And I'll come to that in a moment. And this leads to a theory of economic decentralization, which also has an ecological dimension to it. In fact, there's been a lot of, given the whole sort of flood of articles that have come out recently, there have been a few on Gandhian economics. I wrote one, but there were others who wrote. And that one of the interesting criticisms that is made that it is not practical, and it's not clear to me, nobody has really proffered reasons as to why they are practical, right? I mean, Gandhi's Satyagraha was never meant to be practical either, I mean, if you know what I mean. So, but the fundamental point of how to look at this notion of Gandhian economics is made by an economist in the 1940s, Anjaria, who was quite well known in his time. And he says that the Gandhian system of economic thought cannot be adequately appraised merely in terms of current economic theory, which rests on certain limited assumptions. It is a challenge to these assumptions themselves. Right? It is not to say that we need to uncritically accept the formulation that is being proffered. Yeah? It is to say that to understand what this economic vision means, let us first understand it on its own terms and then try and parse it as to how to relate it with the larger questions that we are interested in today. Right? So this point is very much alive even today. Okay, so there's been, many of you may be familiar with this term permanence that Kumarappa sort of gave currency. I want to point out that his notion of permanence is not an ecological one. It's not in terms of sustainability and stuff like as it is generally understood. That derives from his philosophical vision of what is known as the natural order. But his notion of permanence is really got to do with a notion of nature itself. So it's sort of, it's abstracted out of the specific calculus of how we do, of our relationship with the environmental question, right? So it's got to do with a philosophical question that has value on its intrinsic terms. So fundamentally, I mean, there's a lot that can be said, but fundamentally he says that something can be deemed to be permanent if it can be judged by objective standards. And in particular, he says that we should be wary of men's desire to do things within a lifetime of 70, right, which was the term in a sort of biblical kind of term, right? So, you have this urge to sort of fulfill your desires and goals and aspirations within a human lifespan. We are all sort of subject to that, that objective in our approach to how we want to go ahead with the rest of our lives. But what he says is the way to understand or parse or judge these actions is to go look beyond what the human short-term objectives are, right? So, and essentially, this is the key point, which is where the departure from conventional economics is absolutely clear. He says that basically there are actions in the real material world, but we're going to judge them in moral terms. Now that's something that we have been trained not to think about, right? Because essentially your whole scientific revolution tries to ask the question, how do we axiomatize the problem? How do we derive or do inference on what those implications of that axiomatization is, and then sort of proceed with it without getting into this notion of value judgments, if you will, right? And the fundamental question is, how far can we get towards a particular desirable objective without making those value judgments? This is a very important question that we have to ask, in many contexts today, right? Now, this is something we tend to shy away from because it's loaded with semantic difficulties, yeah? But nevertheless, it has to be confronted at some level. So his particular yardstick of valuation is to say, he wants to ask, to what extent is any of our actions in congruence with nature? So now you would talk about sustainability, living within resource limits, and so on and so forth. But this is sort of a deeper philosophical idea. And then he yokes it to a framework of moral obligations, right? Now this is a little bit, it's out of your mainstream purview, right? I mean, ecological economics may try and value the goods and services that nature provides, if you will, right? I mean, we were talking about carbon trading a little while ago and so on and so forth. But this notion that you have some kind of obligations, and the obligations are both to human beings, well, to all sentient beings, but also to the environment, to the ecosystem that you're part of. And now that's a pretty tall order, right? But that's where it is, and that's where they want to place their understanding. Okay, so fundamentally, so this is, I think, I'll just sort of quickly pass through this. So Kumarappa's one point, note the year, 1947, right? When we are about to embark on a very different kind of trajectory than these guys are proposing. This is what he says. He says, progress signifies both the search after knowledge and truth found in nature and its application to satisfy human needs. So please note this. So this is because there's a lot of myth making around what these people represented. They are not against human beings fulfilling their material needs. Okay, it is not a do-nothing philosophy where you just sort of live in a very, reduced state of material existence. There's a clear recognition that for human welfare and well-being, there is a minimal level of material welfare that has to be available to everybody. But the point is, if you believe in a democratic order where everybody has access to that, then the consequences for them are very clear. Then you have to get a decentralized economy where the rewards are moderate. You cannot have the kind of unequal world order we have today, right? Today, I mean, recent numbers tell us that the top 8 wealthiest Indians own as much assets as the bottom, anyone? 50%. Just think about the scale of the numbers. Think about what is the nature of an economic order that gives rise to this kind of an inequality? Forget about Gini coefficient and stuff like that. It's not going to get us very far. It's fundamentally a moral question then. It's no longer a question of just measuring coefficients and trying to make sense of them, right? Because it's off the, it's off the scale in that sense, right? So it's no longer a question of tinkering with some policies, so, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what they are trying to argue for, and this is why the resistance came from the middle class and the intelligentsia. They said that they were very categorically clear. And they are essentially saying, walk the talk. And very few of us, myself included, would be really up to doing it, right? If it really comes down to it, yeah. But they were very clear that if you want to have true economic justice in a society and recognize that there are ecological constraints within which you have to operate, increasingly that's staring us in the face today, right? But remember, in the 30s, this was not seen as a big problem. even in terms of agrarian settlements in India, there was still a lot of land that was unsettled, right? And natural resources were still not as desecrated as they are today. Yeah, today there isn't a single water body on this planet that is not desecrated. I wouldn't even call it polluted. I mean, in India it is just simple desecration. Yeah, so they were very clear that, and this idea of imposing limits is not an advocacy of poverty. Let's not mix these two things up. No advocate of social or economic justice would want poverty in society. Now, there's a difference between the term voluntary poverty, which is limited to a certain set of people, perhaps, who choose to do that. But for society at large, the point is very simple, that if you truly believe in justice, then this is a necessary outcome of your axiom of justice. There's no getting away from it. That if everybody has to have a reasonable, not even necessarily a mathematically equal share, an arithmetically equal share, but if you believe in an egalitarian society with an ideal towards equity and justice, then this is a necessary outcome. Okay, and this point was emphasized a lot in what they had to say. But the other point that Kumarappa makes is that he talks about, which is now well recognized, that endless growth is a false scale of values, right? You cannot simply, anyone who studied elementary differential equations will tell you that an exponential function will just, take over everything in no time, right? Eventually it'll catch up with the limits that are there. There's no getting away from that point. Okay, so, but along with it is the very important point that they make, is that human needs are bodily, that is material needs, spiritual needs, the bodily as in terms of well-being, but also the material needs that they have, right? So these are all things that one has to be concerned about. Maybe I'll just skip this. So quickly, in terms of an understanding of the economic order that was being advocated then and is very much there today, is that Kumarappa very clearly rejects this myth of the economic man, right? This idea that you have this atomized individual who's going to maximize their utility function, right? And then you will have outcomes out of that, is something that they very clearly rejects. And then he says that economic theory has, he's critiquing the marginal revolution, and he says economic theory has gone to seed in mathematical formula rather than being presented as a fascinating psychological study of human nature. There's an understanding of what human beings are, right? And then I don't want to spend too much time, but one of the key points that we should recognize is that in their lifetime, the debate was really largely between capitalism and socialism, right? You had the colonial order, which was sort of represented capitalist economy, and many people in India were very enamored of the socialist revolution, right? Many big names in India, you can look through the history of that, and these guys were essentially saying no, because we don't want to be caught up in between these two poles, because both of them fundamentally have large-scale industrialization that underlies their understanding of how to produce goods, if you will. And therefore, there are implications of what a large-scale economy is going to do. So they didn't want to get caught up in the state versus market debate either, right? And so fundamentally, the criticism that Kumarappa provided is essentially that these are standard things that we know today, that high-level investments of capitalism can produce a lot of goods and will achieve efficiencies of scale, in a manner of speaking, but the fundamental problem is going to be, now production is going to be dealing from consumption, right? So today, in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of talk about how to stimulate rural demand, right? They're all worried that Parle-G is not selling too well, yeah? But more seriously, the question that we should ask is, if your Parle-G is coming from a couple of factories somewhere, what does it really afford to the local economy other than just sort of draw the resources out of it, right? So the fundamental question, even today when you're talking about stimulating rural demand, taking money from RBI and pumping it to the industrialists and so on and so forth, there's really not much of a discussion of what kind of an economic system do you want to build, where what they want to do is to actually join, producers with consumers, essentially. I've skipped my slides there, but yeah, so the essential question, the reason Gandhi was interested in khadi and so on and so forth was not just because he wanted to make cloth. It was a means, cloth was in some sense an excuse, if you will. It was a means to achieve an objective of bootstrapping economic activity, but also be able to then, Kumarappa and others developed it where you sort of link people in a local kind of context. And there's been a lot of criticism of this idea of Gandhi's notion of an autarkic village, and it's not. Yeah, it's not meant to be. It simply says most of your needs should be satisfied within your local region, because otherwise there are both economic and human consequences for trade, right? So for example, if you look at this whole business of sweatshops, this road, Hosur Road, is full of these sweatshops producing garments for the global economy, right? And somebody buying it somewhere else has no idea what's going on here. Well, neither do we, yeah. So, but, so this is the point that they were trying to make, that they wanted that local production for local consumption. And let us also not mix, and so the idea is that this is where you can see human values are visible in the transactions that we make, right? I'm not saying that all those transactions are necessarily very smooth or easy to deal with. It is not to paint an idealized sort of romantic idea of what a local economy might necessarily look like. But fundamentally, these are the questions that they were raising as to what is the nature of the economic system that we'll have, where will the balance of economic power be, right? And I should also emphasize that they were not talking about making handicrafts for the urban economy, because there's a lot of confusion about Gandhi, right? That, but that's like, every day there are articles in newspaper of people who are saving handloom weavers by selling their products in the city, right? Except like somebody like Prasanna who's committed a lifetime to it. I mean, there are lots of people floating around. You open the Hindu and you'll see it, right? That's not the kind of economy that these people were talking about. They were not talking about producing cloth so that you and I can buy it, because today then we can choose to take our custom somewhere else tomorrow, right? So that was a fundamental economic challenge that they had, and this was built into a theory of decentralization that Kumarappa offered. So the fundamental attribute is really local production for local consumption, because one of the fundamental, I'll just take 2 more minutes, and one of the fundamental aspects that's actually often forgotten in the larger sort of macro debates about what economic systems should look like and all that, is got to do with the lived experience of being a human economic actor. And I find, of all the things that Kumarappa has written, he has this beautiful essay called Philosophy of Work. Yeah, it's very, very deeply insightful and very moving, because it fundamentally talks about the fact that he asks that, what is the meaning of work? And work is both drudgery and creativity. It has both aspects to it. And throughout human history, what we have tried to do is pass off the drudgery to someone else and keep the creative part to ourselves, right? I don't need to give you examples. This is encoded in the way we live. And so this is essentially what he was objecting to, right? If you really fundamentally believe in egalitarian principles, that this cannot go on, right? So it was whether it's slavery or the caste system in India and so on and so forth. These are all, examples of it. And he recognizes that there is a notion of division of labor that has to come in to get some level of efficiency into the system. But the question really is, how far do you go, right? And so your assembly line has he calls it has all the undesirable qualities of a curse, right? And you can see the consequences today. I mean, there are new versions of that, right? The so-called gig economy that people talk about, and this whole new body of work that's not talking about precarious work, right? I mean, precarity and the consequences of that. So work has a very central role in the Gandhian understanding of what it means, and fundamentally, it's to do with the question of affording both a livelihood, building a healthy economic order, but also enabling human beings to live lives with dignity, right? If you do not have, you may have income, but you don't have a sense of purpose, or if you have neither, then you're in trouble, right? So you need both, yeah? And so there was a very clear recognition of this question. Now, how to go about doing that is a huge challenge. So I will leave it at that, but there are other things that I'm happy to talk about in terms of what Kumarappa's understanding was in terms of machinery, in terms of the role of money in the monetized economy, and so on and so forth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you firstly for inviting me. It's a big honor. So I'll start by telling you a story. which Anupam Mishra used to tell. Somebody was just telling me that you're one of the few places that had a event to honor his memory. Anupam Mishra was a great activist of Gandhian orientation, Gandhian values. He did some exceptional work on water, India's water systems. So in that research, he came upon this story, which he tells in one of his books, that long, long ago, let's just say some pre-modern time, a little girl, maybe 10, 11 years old, was going to the field to give food to her father and his brothers who were working on the family land. They were farmers. And she stumbles upon a stone, and she gets hurt. So like a child, the sickle that she had in her hand, she beats the stone because it has bumped, it has given her an ouch. And the sickle turns to gold. And she's old enough to know that this is something very significant. So she takes the stone, she picks up that stone and she gives it to her father and his brothers. Now I have a question for you before I continue with the story. What do you think they should do? The first option, the obvious, yes, go ahead, please. You want to give me one option?
I think they should not use everything they have and turn it to gold.
They should not turn everything to gold. Okay, that we know from the Midas story, right? So that one is important. The first option I want to offer you is that they use it for their family, they become very wealthy, they build a palace. And that's one option. The second possibility, actually let me call them possibilities. The second possibility is that the brothers fall at each other's throat. That's a very real possibility, na? They can become each other's life and death enemies. One can say, no, it was my daughter who found the stone. The other can say, no, but it was on our land, so it belongs to, whatever. I mean, there's, right? What is the third possibility? Is there a third possibility? So there is one, and that's what they did. They took the stone to the king. Why? Because the legend says they immediately realized that it was a potential curse, this stone. Plus they said, see, actually all this land is the land of the king, right? We live in the kingdom of X king, so we should give it to him. Now it turned out, and it has to turn out this way, right? It's a fairy tale. The king was even smarter than them. When they presented him, isko paras money kehte hain. In Hindi, it's called paras money. I'm sure you have a Kannada term for it, because the idea of this stone that turns any base metal to gold is there pretty much across the world. So the king is even smarter than them, and he says, I give it back to you with one piece of advice. Use it wisely to create true wealth. And the story goes that they go back to the village and they do use that stone in a very limited way to turn some metals into gold, but their focus is on building 4 large man-made lakes. Each of the brothers takes the task of creating a large man-made water body, and that generated enormous prosperity in the whole region, because it served the humans, it served through agriculture, it helped animals, and endless. I mean, I don't have to go into the obvious. So, this story, I like to begin with this story because it gives you the 2 basic possibilities that are there, and I would argue that they are still there before us, even though, as the previous presentation showed, the force of events and history is very much seems contradictory. So the first possibility is trusteeship, which is what these brothers did. Oh, by the way, sorry, Anupam's story ends by saying that in the region from which this story comes, which is around Jabalpur in Madhya Pradesh, you do actually have 4 lakes of approximately 700 to 800 years antiquity, which are named after the 4 brothers in the story. Okay, so now I'll leave that there. I love to play with the enormous possibilities of this story. So today we'll spend, and I'll really only take about 12 to 15 minutes more because I want us to have more time later for discussion. The one possibility is trusteeship, what these brothers did. And the other one is what the rest of the world is training you and me to do and demanding that we do every moment that we are living and breathing, which is to maximize profit. That is the dominant trend. Okay? Now, very briefly, what is the history of both these ideas? Now, greed is not new. Okay? That also, let us be very clear. Greed is not invented by Wall Street. But the glorification of greed is a very new phenomenon in human history. So, because the underlying moral principle, or in this sense we should say the amoral principle behind the profit maximization logic, is that greed is good, it is natural, it is what makes human beings dynamic. Now, the truth is that until about the 1700s, and that too only in Western Europe, across the world, in different kinds of cultures, the common thing that you find is that the commercial side of life is deemed to be subservient to the social and moral, or what in India we call Samaj. That the Samaj aspect of life was the predominant one. It was the decider. So in fact, if you consider our idea of Purusharth in India, Dharma comes before Arth. For this reason, that the basis of what and how you accumulate, what you call wealth and how you accumulate it is more important than the mechanics. And this is true for pretty much the whole world. I'm not saying that therefore there was some utopia in the past, but simply that there was a difference between what was glorified. Of course there was greed, of course there was theft, but it was not considered to be the correct way. It was not glorified and valorized. This changes pretty much with the arrival of modernity. And there are 2-3 key events for that, but the fundamental shift is in the early 1700s. It happens on both sides of the English Channel, and it is, we don't have time today to go into the sort of anthropology of that moment in history, but basically what emerges is this idea that, you know, all this thing about virtue and looking out for your neighbor and cooperation and all that, this is all very limiting ideas, morality that has been imposed on us by the priesthood. Actually, what makes human beings dynamic, successful, and therefore what constitutes progress is to celebrate the virtue of vice. And if anybody wants to see this in action, please do look up, it's all online, a poem called The Fable of the Bees. The Fable of the Bees, bees in Madhumakhi. Please look it up. It is in this atmosphere that Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations, and it's published, of course, very interestingly in the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, 1776. It is this and the worldview that this gives rise to that John Ruskin militates against when he writes a book called Unto This Last, which is deeply influential of both Kumarappa and Gandhi. So, in 1930, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who is considered at that time in the pre-war Europe and both sides of the Atlantic, Keynes is considered the last word on formal economic thinking. He writes an essay in which he actually argues that yes, this is a sad state of affairs, but that's the only way for us to have progress. So for another 100 years, and now I'm quoting literally, he says for another 100 years at least, we must continue to pretend that virtue is false and vice is true. Because virtue doesn't work very well and vice gets us what we want. And this is the crux of what Gandhi is revolting against. Gandhi is saying that this is nonsense. This is anti-civilizational. You cannot have a human civilization based on this notion. And it is when he says that trusteeship is a viable option, he means that you have to revolt against this assumption that the celebration of vice, which is what? Greed, disregard for means. And by the way, this is very common to capitalism and communism. Let's have no illusions. It was because communism had no confusion about the supremacy of ends, that the gulags were justified, mass death through starvation was justified, mass decimation of the environment was justified. So in this respect of giving primacy to the end and disregarding the means, communism and capitalism are blood brothers. And it is in opposition to both that Gandhi is saying way back in the 20s and 30s and 40s that both will collapse, both are unsustainable, and the future belongs to trusteeship. Why is that relevant today? Because when Keynes said in 100 years we can, basically he said it in 1930. So we are not very far now. If Keynes was going to be correct, we are now 10 years away from being able to live with a glorification of virtue rather than vice. But it's not going to happen. Because his fundamental assumption was that in 100 years, the human species will be in a post-scarcity situation. Food, shelter, clothing, education, health, all that will be sorted out. We will have, finally, human species will be in a state where it can only worry about salvation or how to write the perfect poem or how to make the most beautiful film. So that has not turned out to be true. Yes, you can show all kinds of data about how more people have been lifted from poverty in the last 20, 30 years. But a lot of that is due to welfare programs, not an economy of permanence. That's one. And as we are finding in many countries, those welfare programs are not sustainable. A nephew of mine who's studying in the Bay Area tells me that you cannot risk wandering about on the streets of San Francisco after dark. Because there are so many homeless people who are also sometimes drug addicts or connected to criminal gangs because of their poverty, that it's a physically risky venture. Okay, so, and I'm giving you the example of San Francisco because that is supposed to be the capital of the successful world today, right? That's the neighborhood of Silicon Valley. So, firstly, that the basic assumption that we would have solved all our material problems has not come true. And additionally, what Keynes could not anticipate is that we have brought a huge environmental catastrophe upon ourselves, which again Gandhi did anticipate. In 20s, 30s and 40s and several places, Gandhi is saying that if we all decide to live as the West is living, and he's saying this of the pre-Second World War West, not the West that took shape after the Second World War, the happy days America of the 50s, okay, with the TV in every home and 2 cars in every garage. He's saying if everyone lives like the West, one planet will not be enough, which is true, right? You all know about the idea of ecological footprint, and you know about Earth Overshoot Day. Every year, that day is moving forward by about a week, 2 weeks. This year it was at the end of August or July, I think. right? Which means what? That by that date, we use up our quota of renewable resources for that year. So where do we go from here? I'll just use 3-4 minutes to highlight what our options are. One is that we can put some hope in the idea of turning the world around to a watered down version of trusteeship, which is known as the triple bottom line. And for anyone who is planning to go into the world of business or commerce, or actually even non-profits, so the triple bottom line, how many people have heard this term? I'm very curious. Triple bottom line? Yeah, okay, very rare, huh? Yeah. So it's an idea that was invented by a British, he's basically an environmentalist, but he became a business consultant through the mid-90s. And so he came up with this term. His name is John Elkington. So triple bottom line is profit, planet, people. And basically what it says is that you have to redesign the traditional balance sheet. And the same balance sheet in which you are looking at your money in, input, output, and profit line, you have to look at how much damage or how much good that company did to the environment and how much damage or how much good it did to people. One version of this concept is limited to inside the company, but the more meaningful version of this concept is about the company's effects on the outside the factory gate, because of its product and because of the way in which its product is generated, etc. So this has had some impact. I'm not saying it is zero, and in Q&A time, if you want, I can give you more details. Suffice to say that in 2006, the United Nations set up something called the Principles of Responsible Investing, okay, which kind of institutionalized. Now the problem with that is that some X trillion dollars worth of companies are registered as signatories of these principles. But they are also, many of them, the same companies that are still doing the worst damage to the planet and to people. And in India, we are very handicapped because we even are, I have met personally people who are really good people, okay, they are not in the rest of their life amoral. But they genuinely believe that we have to get ahead, we have to build our GDP, we have to have more dams, more mines, more highways before we can talk about environmental and social justice. When that moment will arrive, nobody says. It's somewhere in some distant past. So the idea that you have to put everything on the same timetable is not unknown in India, but it is not popular. Okay, because whatever we may have done in the last 30, 40 years, our self-image is that we are still catch-up. We are still in a catch-up game. And I'm hoping that Amit will talk about how dead-endish that catch-up game is. So basically there are three things that we can look at. One, as I said, is triple bottom line. The second, which is in a sense an extension of triple bottom line, is to emphasize purity of means over the end product. So for example, the value of a business enterprise, what makes it a trustee, is not how much money it gives away, but how it earned the profit in the first place. And that is a very big dilemma for many companies. Again, I don't want to go into details because I really want to save time for the discussion. And the third, which is the hardest to do, but actually is the most compelling, because this takes us back to the story in the beginning, is to equate wealth with well-being. Rather than gold, stocks, shares, money, bonds, which as you all know are extremely fragile, huh? Right? Tomorrow, your stock market worth today may be 1 crore, tomorrow it may be 60 lakhs. So the paper wealth in all its forms, whether it's a fixed deposit in a bank, so firstly it is fragile and unreliable, and secondly, or rather actually that is the first one, you really actually cannot live on it. You realize that, right? It's this classic story about somebody who has lots of credit cards and gets stuck on a deserted island where there's no food, no water. That credit cards are not going to keep him alive. At the end of the day, actual wealth for human beings is that which gives us either nourishment or protects us from the weather or enables us to live in the kind of comfort that gives us the chance to do the higher functions of the human consciousness, including coming to university. So I'll pause here by just sharing that however grim the situation looks in the present, and I've deliberately not gone into the grimmest information about the environmental crisis, because I'm taking it as read. I'm assuming that you all know what we are looking at, and it's not very far. It'll happen in my lifetime, and your lifetime will certainly be dominated by having to deal with, in your everyday life, the consequences of the environmental collapse. That no matter how dark things look, being depressed about it is complicity. And never ever doubt the power of a defiant optimism and a defiant moral stand. It has moved mountains in the past, and that actually is what is the basis of human civilization. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rajni Chandan, for asking me to come. It's very good. Very happy to have this chance, the opportunity to talk here. That story is very nice, that tank story. And I thought, if in case there are economists in the room, I thought I should also say that it's probably also a very Adam Smithian story, because it's anti-mercantilist, don't hoard gold, invest in infrastructure, and grow your economy. Right? So yes, so public infrastructure, but presumably consumed privately. We didn't hear that part. So, if anybody was feeling uncomfortable, I'm giving you some peace with that story. Okay, so I'll say a few things about Gandhi, what I wanted to say, what we can learn from him and so forth. But since there are a lot of students, I couldn't resist also making one prefatory remark, which is, how do you read people like Gandhi? And particularly people like Gandhi, because they're very difficult to read as time goes by. They say a lot of things, and you don't know exactly which ones to take seriously and which ones not, and these kinds of things. Right? They say lots of things that you disagree with, and that's true not just for Gandhi, but for many, many such people. So my general rule of thumb is, if you feel the urge to critique, don't. It's not useful. What I mean by that is not that you have to take what everything is true. What I mean is, you take what you want. Because you are sitting here and you know what your values are, and you understand what is good today. So you take what you need and you just throw the rest. You're wasting your energy if you think you can criticize somebody like Marx or Ambedkar or Gandhi or any number of such people. That's not what they're here for. They're here to teach what you can learn, and you just disregard the rest. If Gandhi on caste doesn't speak to you, don't worry about it. There are many, many other people on caste who are much, much better than him, and I also believe that. You go there. But I don't think I will go to Ambedkar if I need a vision of a future economy that is sustainable. He doesn't have it. So that's the thing. You have to just develop that sense. So that was my only prefatory sort of Gyan distribution. So let me come to the matter at hand. I like this quote from Nagaraj a lot. Dear Nagaraj, if you haven't read, you must. Chandan will tell you all about him. is one of a brilliant Kannada writer, theorist, thinker, who's unfortunately no more with us, died early. But this quote from him really captures what, if you want to approach Gandhi from that side of things, from philosophical side of things, he's the philosopher of everyday life. And hopefully some things that I say might make it clearer. If not, I can also pull it out during presentation as well. So I have only 3 slides actually, and I'll spend roughly sort of 1/3 time, I think, on each, maybe a little bit more on the first one. The first one is a list of things that can be learned from Gandhi, and each of them are big things that deserve thought in themselves. So I won't obviously be opening up each of those, but these are things that I have found useful in him. Or when I say him, really I'm referring to the body of work, right? Not just writings, but the projects and Kumarappa's work, which Venu very nicely, and I, by the way, highly recommend Venu and Deepak's book. It's an excellently researched, meticulous book on Kumarappa, and the bibliography is even better because it gives you. Well, I knew you were going to say that. The text is very good too. But if you want to go to the horse's mouth, and one of the real discoveries of that, speaking of bibliography, was I often taught the Gandhi-Nehru correspondence. Some people will know what I'm talking about, on villages, which is from their letters from the 40s. But actually the JPJC correspondence, it's not letters, but articles written by Kumarappa and Jayaprakash Narayan when he was a Marxist, are much, much better. They go much deeper into the issues. So to understand those two positions, anyway, so that was also an aside. Here are some of the useful things that I find. Actually, let me just pull it here so I don't have to keep looking at that. The first one is really what I wanted to do most of the talk about, but then I thought that it might be better to cast the net a little bit wider. People can, I've written about this in other places, so you can see that. In what you see in Gandhi is, one way of reading it is that knowledge is where the real strength of people lies. The strength of the people in reconstituting themselves. Reconstituting was very nicely pointed out, not about trying to find out what happened in history and recreating it. That's not what this means. But when you want to reinvent yourself, let's say, you want to do something, where do you go? What constitutes your strength? And it seems trivial, but actually it is very profound, because most of the other political projects precisely deny this to people. You are, to use the popular word, masses. So you show up when there's a show of strength needed. But society is not necessarily based on what you think should happen in society. You are either the recipient of welfare, or the producer of surplus, or a person who shows up to a political rally and shows that there are numbers here. But not the class on whose thinking society will be reconstructed, built in the future. And that's really how Gandhi, I think, should be understood. All the experiments with village industries, all the experiments or writings on Panchayati Raj, all of these things are attempts to see where lie the people, and I'm using this very uncritically, I know, what does people mean? Immediately a lot of questions arise, and I want to set those aside for a little bit, can come back to that. But there is a center of gravity as far as political institutions and beliefs go, cultural beliefs go, economic understanding goes. That's where you start from. You don't end there, but you start there, because there is actually no other place to start. So, as one of the activists that I often work with says, if you want to, this is a northern reference, let me adapt it to the south. I have to think very quickly. If you want to go from Gulbarga to Bangalore, can you start in Bijapur? No. I mean, you are in Gulbarga, right? So, if you want to base an economy on a people who are not there yet, what do? You think of them as not being there yet. And all your policies are about getting there somewhere, from there where the journey is going to start. So it is all about reaching out, educating, making sure that there is a point at which everybody is now ready to launch into the new economy. That is precisely what Gandhi is saying you shouldn't do. You start where you are, and you make use of that thing which you've got. And that is the first point, which what you've got is your way of understanding the world, which includes everything, includes how to organize economic activity, how to produce things, all of that stuff. So that is the first kind of thing that we take, and I can talk about this at length because I've written about it a lot, but I will move on to a few other points that I think are worth noting. This, by the way, is what Lokvidya, which was referred to in the introduction, is. That's the word we've been using when we talk about this kind of people's knowledge-based economy. The second point, this you see a lot in Kumarappa, and you see a lot of it in Lohia also, whose name hasn't come up today, but who's sort of the continuer of some of these thinkings in a different way. That technology itself is a product of social relations, which means one should not think of technology, what form it takes, which direction it goes, as somehow given. It arises out of society, out of relations of society, out of who controls the means of production and the means of knowledge production. It is their needs that guide technology. And this point again sounds very trivial, but even a good Marxist may often slip into thinking that the forces of production have a logic. And this is where that thing that was referred to with socialism, one of the problems was that despite Marx writing specific, and Marx said this too, by the way, this is not talk about Marx, so I didn't mention that, but that technology should not be taken as given and that people have to adapt to it, but rather it is a product of the way society is organized, was made by many people. And so Marxists actually erred, I think, in not taking that seriously. It is there in their tradition too. It's certainly there in the Gandhian tradition. And this goes back to what Venu said about equity. The nature of technology changes profoundly when equity is a constraint. Equity as a constraint changes everything. I mean, that Venu already made that point. What I mean by equity is, equal participation, equal, whatever the relevant equal dimension is. If that is you're actually serious about that, then many things are different already. You can't do them at all. So the question doesn't arise as to can everybody have a cell phone, can everybody have a computer, and so forth, because you only produce those things that everybody can have. You don't produce things that some people can have and then worry about whether everybody can have them. The answer, by the way, is no. Right? So then that's just an example for technology, but of course, as I said, equity is a principle that changes everything. Right? Trade, same thing. It's not a question of can you trade globally, should you trade globally, and so forth. If you put equity considerations in the center of the economy, what can be traded and what can't be traded follows from there. And what you will find is that most things can't be traded. Big surprise. Right? So that's the kind of the second major lesson on how to pay attention to what technological change means, how to understand what how it happens. And I've already talked about the third point connectedly, so I won't belabor that point. In this Gandhian tradition, equity is the guiding principle. Right? If it works for everybody, it works. If it only works for some people, that's not called working in this tradition. And that's actually a very, very hard constraint. You can imagine. And as Venu also said, it's an ideal. I mean, it's not something that you're going to get to today, but the question is that in your sights? Or are you still trapped in a paradigm where you'll do what can be done and then worry about distributing it equally, which is not going to happen. Right? And it is an endlessly deferred thing, endlessly promised but never delivered. The head-hand dichotomy, again, this came up a little bit when Venu was talking about the outsourcing of drudgery. Right? Gandhi is one of the people, Kumarappa, a lot of people who work on Nai Talim. Varda is not here, I think. You can speak to Varda if you're interested in Nai Talim kind of thinking. All of this stuff is about ending this head-hand dichotomy. Head-hand dichotomy is a thing that goes back a long time. It's not a Gandhi thing. Benjamin Farrington has a very nice book many years ago on the head-hand dichotomy in Greece. What we mean is the division of labor between mental work and manual work. So division of labor of equal status is not the problem. Division of labor that creates hierarchies of this kind is the problem. Right? So we are not talking about the fact that engineers should do the work of doctors. What we are saying is you shouldn't have engineers and supervisors and mechanics and foremen and all the rest of it, where the brain work is done by some people, the hand work is done by other people, and there's a complete separation of imagining, executing, and all of this. Right? If you want to see a person who is really thinking very clearly about this, you can read Frederick Taylor, who's called the father of scientific management, from where the term Taylorism also comes. So Taylor's self-professed goal, what he writes about in his book is, I know that there are artisans in the world who know all these things, and they also work on these things. My goal is to make sure that I can take what they know and leave them to follow the orders of the others who will now base their work on what is known by them. So that's my task, is to separate these two things. Right? A very explicitly anti-Gandhian position, which he succeeded in doing, and happily the Soviets also adapted it. Again, another incidence of a problem there, not to belabor that point. So through Nai Talim, through these symbols like the charkha and so forth, what is going on is this challenging of a very, very deep-rooted dichotomy, much deeper actually than caste also. I mean, caste is obviously there, and it's a very huge problem when you start talking about the division of labor, as Ambedkar also says. But the head hand is, even more pervasive than caste. The next point to learn: states, markets, and communities. The very nice thing about reading Gandhi and his thought and his experiments is that you never really get caught in this or that or anything like that. It's a very nice way of navigating all these three institutions that everybody knows exist all the time, everywhere. And the question is, what should be allocated by what? There are always going to be markets, there are always going to be communities, and there are always going to be states, governments. Who should do what is your problem? That's the question in front of you. And Gandhi, of course, has a range of things to say about what should be done where, and sometimes very provocative things that many of us might also disagree with. He, for example, believes that education should be self-financing. Schools they should just raise their own money. Why should you subsidize schools? And so forth. Right? So there's many kinds of interesting things there on where do profit motives work, where does the public purpose work, where does a larger geographical scale, where is a larger geographical scale necessary, where is a smaller geographical scale necessary. All of these things have to be thought through. There are no answers ready-made, but in Gandhi you will find this creative combination of all these things. Then there are some things that maybe some aficionados would like. I'm not belaboring those. These are for the economists. Preferences are social and endogenous. Right? Without that, there is no actual action possible in the world. If you couldn't change what people thought they liked and didn't like and so forth, you couldn't get them to act. So they change. You change them. But I won't talk much about that. I won't talk much about the last one either, the second last one either, which is moral, ecological, economic decisions are intertwined. Venu has already done a great job of showing how these things are always together. They are just false separations. The fact-value separation, which was alluded to, is a very damaging thing that is there. And if you're interested, many people have written about this, that there is a separation possible between fact and value. The way it's often taught in economics and other places is positive and normative economics. Right? So it's possible to do this sort of description, a positive meaning an objective description, and then on the basis of that some normative statements can be made. Those values come from elsewhere. That's not the job of the person who is doing the objective description. It's all just garbage. The last thing is actually an interesting thing, and if I have a few minutes in the end, I'll come back. This is Chandan's territory. I go there with great trepidation. This is on history, and nowadays it's become very difficult to give any. Sorry, I changed it on mine. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So the new farmers' movements refers to these very large mobilizations that happened with the organizations like the Shetkari Sangatna, the Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, Bharatiya Kisan Union. There were many large farmer unions that had mounted enormous agitations in the 80s, and these were all very interesting from the Gandhian perspective because they were talking about the rural economy. They were talking about, so I'll just read out a quote to you from one of the participants. It's actually from a book that chronicles this movement. Let me just, it's one of the leaders of the movement, and I read you the quote, I think you'll get what I mean by the Gandhian connection. Yeah. Our struggle, this is one of the farmer leaders from Gujarat talking about it in the 80s. Our struggle is not for issues like electricity tariffs or land legislation. We have a wider vision. The whole of the rural economy should be changed. It should not be a field of exploitation as it has been since British rule. A generating center for the national economy. It should not be that. The surplus should remain in the villages, and from this, the appropriate growth of village-based industries and development should be made, rather than exploiting the villages to create a surplus for urban-based industries, which only create unemployment and poverty. So there was a very clear understanding here of what they were trying to do. They were trying to retain the surplus in the villages. Another popular slogan in those days was, we don't need you to build schools and hospitals. You let us retain our earnings, we'll build our own schools and hospitals. Right? So it's instead of taking all the surplus, and then again this is that point about, do you redistribute after exploitation, or do you avoid that whole question in the first place? So the New Farmers Movement was very creative kind of application of this ideals. Again, a lot of writing has been done on it, so if you're interested I can definitely point you to some things. The second one, which is more familiar to I think most people, is the anti-displacement struggles that happened in the 90s and the 2000s, Narmada and many similar ones. Here again, there is a very clear Gandhian thought in action, which is not only non-violence and satyagraha and all that, which is of course there, but it is more explicitly about local control of local resources. And if you look at it from the knowledge perspective, it is about the proposition that people know how to make use of these resources. That somebody else doesn't have more efficient uses that they can be put to, right? Which is usually how you think of these acquisition kind of processes. So these movements, the Jal Jangal Zameen movements, of course they invoke Gandhi also many times, but even when they don't invoke Gandhi, the ghost is very much there still, always, in this local control kind of thinking. The third one is a bit unusual. These are the backward caste movements. And these are very interesting. Of course now they've all lost their promise, just like all the other movements. By the way, what is common to the top three is that they're all done now. So we need to think anew about what's next. The third one is particularly done. It had some promise in the 90s. I'm talking about, in the south it was much earlier. In the north it happened in the 70s and 80s. I'm talking about the emergence in politics of the Yadavs, of the Patels, of the Kurmis, of many castes which were beneficiaries of the Green Revolution, but had not been in political power during British rule. I mean, these are all castes that were traditional rulers of where they came from, but their position had been usurped during the colonial period by the Brahmin, the British Brahmin alliance, and they were now regaining their position, and that happened all over the country. I mean, you know the story very well. In every part of India, slowly power went back to where it always was, right? With these agrarian castes. But why I'm bringing it up here with Gandhi is because the people who were most attracted to Gandhi's ideas about panchayats, about industries, rural industries and so on, were these castes. And the reason is very simple. Because the Brahmins, of course, had no connection at all to any of these industries to begin with. And anyway, during British rule, many of them moved out into new occupations, became educated and so forth. And the Dalits had no interest in continuing what was obviously a degrading traditional occupation. So for them anyway, there was never a question of reconnecting to the past. It was actually a matter of rejection of the past. So setting the Brahmins and the Dalits aside, who did not have much to resonate with in this way of thinking, it was the middle castes. It was the artisanal castes and the peasant castes who saw that there was something here that they had, going back to the knowledge question that I was talking about, and who also thought that they had the capacity to get political power. This is again, one of those things. It has to be tangible also, right? You can't be a very, very marginalized community and dream of political power, because that's not where you're coming. That's not the history that you have. These castes have a history of power, so it's a legitimate, tangible goal to recover it. And when I say they are spent, what I mean is that was the promise, that something else could have happened. And the Hindutva movement, which is now the late 2000s bringing us today, is precisely a tragedy because it went in exactly the direction that it should not have gone. The triumph of Hindu nationalism is in taking the energies of these castes and these movements and harnessing them successfully to a very damaging Brahminical project. And it is really bad that this happened, that this could happen, that there was not enough in those movements to resist it. I'm not saying that it's all a done deal, obviously. The resistance can still happen, but this is the tragedy, that all of that kind of energy went in the direction of Hindutva in many, many places. And it continues to do that. So that's what brings me to the last, which I'll just do anyway, because it's not my field or anything, but I want to venture there. So here's Nagaraj again, right? The folk imagination makes God/heroes intimate in a way which removes awe and obedience. Each folk tradition has its own Ayodhya, Dandaka forest and Sarayu river, which are all situated nearby. Gandhi is all over this. It's local theology, right? Just as you have local economy, you have local theology. Yes, there is an Ayodhya, but it's the one that's near my village. It doesn't have to be somewhere else where you say that you've discovered some remnants of whatever it is that you've discovered. Right? The second quote is from an article from a few weeks back from the Hindu on how Muharram is celebrated in parts of North Karnataka. This is a guy who is a professor who is saying this. The singers have infused their present-day pains in the historical tragedy. They speak as if the Karbala martyrs were born in their own village. Right? So the Karbala fight is a historical fight, happens in 7th century, happens in Iraq, happens between two communities. We know all the history. For this, it's not relevant. Right? It doesn't matter what the actual historical thing was, but it still matters. This is what I meant in that first point. It's allegorical and not literal. Here's the last point, the poem. Read this poem. This is a qawwali that is recently been performed by Taj Muhammad, Shad Muhammad Qawwal, who are pretty good qawwali musicians from Pakistan. This poem is a 18th century poem from Amroha in UP. And see what he's saying in translation. Okay, it's a poem in praise of Krishna. Mathura Basi Kumar Kaniyya, Mohan Pyare, Bansi Dhari. It's all Krishna's attributes. Flute holder and so forth. I have not translated the first two lines, but let's look at the last lines. And let them sink in. When Krishna became Muhammad, he showed us the path of Islam. When Krishna became Ali, he fought the enemies, whatever those enemies were. And when he became Hussein, he sacrificed himself for everyone. So this is where I want to end, is Gandhi is doing this a lot actually. When he uses history, he's using it in this allegorical sense. That's why when you bring the literal historical perspective, you always make the mistake that Venu pointed out people make, taking back to the past. It's a ridiculous thing. It only can occur to you if you have the literal view of history in mind. If you think that this is how things happen, it can be excavated. By the way, Nagaraj has a very good essay on this particular thing, which is a critique of essentialist and constructivist paradigms, as he calls them. He says it's a mistake to counter Hindutva's historical understanding, which is steeped in European notions of history, with thinking that you can counter it by saying, actually what happened was this, and let me show you that this is what happened. And you should listen to me because I have better evidence and a better method than yours, which of course it's true, I'm not disagreeing with that, because there's no method over there, it's entirely politically motivated. But if you think it's going to defeat it, you might be mistaken. What you need is, a kind of utna baithna wala sambandh between the gods. The gods need to be able to speak to each other. So in this Muharram that this guy is talking about, Hanuman and Hussein together fight Yazid. Right? There are many Ram Leelas that you will find in Bengal and so forth, where Ali regularly appears in Ram Leelas. He's there to lend a hand in because you might need some more support. Right? Because fighting evil people is difficult. You need all the help that you can get. So that sitting together, eating together of gods, does it have more? That is the question. And I'll leave you with that thought. Obviously, I don't have the answers. So thank you.
Yesterday, a friend showed me a video of how the Dagar communities break up their instruments after the 10 days of silence during war.
That was back-to-back heavy content, right? And I'm not sure whether you remember your questions in the first presentation by the time we entered the third presentation or ended it. But the floor is open, and anyone who wants to ask a question, just raise your hands. And maybe it'd be good if you tell us which speaker you're asking that question from, or if it's a general question, any one of us will jump in.
So I'll just be quick. In terms of what Amit just pointed out, how to read Gandhi, if I may proffer I'm in agreement with what he says. If I may proffer one yardstick is to remember that Gandhi was essentially speaking to a variety of classes and communities in India. And so he would naturally tailor his message to the audience that he's talking to. And what happens is when you put all of them into the 100 volumes of collected works, and then you forget the context within which that's coming from, there's a lot of confusion that arises. Yeah. And so one specific point that maybe if I may add to this point about education being self-financing, Amit, is it arises because basically Congress had committed to prohibition as part of their agenda for India. Yeah. And Congress had signed on. Gandhi wanted prohibition. They said, okay, you want it, we'll pass a resolution, no problem. But then when it came to 1937 provincial governments, and Gandhi said, what about prohibition? This is part of the Congress mandate. And so then in particular from the Madras presidency, a lot of, ICS Babus turned up to meet him and said, look, you want education, right? But we're going to have trouble funding it if you bring in prohibition. And that's precisely the point where Gandhi said, if this is the manner in which we want to educate our children, I don't want it, and which is where he came up with this idea of it being self-financing. So it is not like an inviolable dictum that he is giving. Yeah.
No, but also Indian archivist really, Dharampal, did research, archival research to show that in pre-British India, how we had village level schools that were exactly this. So I'll leave it at that. The Beautiful Tree by Dharampal. If it's not in your library, please do a satyagraha.
So any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Is there a mic we can pass around? Yeah.
I have one question each for Venu sir and ma'am. So when sir you were talking about the emphasis on village industries and it has to go beyond handicraft, then what is essentially the scope of village industries? And to ma'am, my question is that the third point that you said, that we need to enable ourselves to reach for the higher goals. That is also essentially the argument that capitalists have been making, saying that some of us, in order for some of us to reach those higher goals, some others need to go down that road of drudgery. So would you want to explain that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, it's the same actually. I think the story that Venu just told, no, about the prohibition and the education, that illustrates, in a sense, that is an answer to your question. It anticipates your question. And actually today, the more self-reflective capitalists are not saying that. So things, see, life is very multi-layered. And at the same time, many things are happening. So I say this to you with a great deal of caution. I'm not saying that capitalism is truly and totally changing. But the tensions inside are always very important. And how many people have heard of Milton Friedman? He was a very influential American economist who is most famous for his quote, "The business of business is business." Meaning that then therefore what you just said, that is the way to go. Or in India, we were told during Narmada Bachao Andolan, I was a supporter of that movement, that, but you, just like you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, how can you have development without some people paying the price for it? But over 40 years of effort, of struggle, and this, to some extent, the rise of this idea of socially responsible investing, there is a dent. So I'm not a fan of Apple, but some years back, Tim Cook was heckled at his AGM because he's pushing for the company to go non-fossil. He's setting some very ambitious targets to make the company free of fossil fuel dependency, and those shareholders were challenging him, this will hit our bottom line in the short term. And he told them that, well, if you're only in this company to make a profit, then I suggest you sell the stock. And recently, 5 years later, and I'm not saying this is because of what Tim Cook said, I just said that, I told you that because it's an interesting anecdote. There is a very influential body called the American Business Roundtable. It consists of pretty much the most powerful companies in the US. They have just now, in August, passed a resolution saying that profit must be, that a stakeholder is as important as a shareholder. And stakeholder includes everybody who is affected by the existence of the company. So there is an effort to undermine this kind of thinking. How far it will go, I can't say.
Okay, so I guess I don't need a mic, I can speak.
No,
okay, yeah. Okay, so the point is that the reason I mentioned that distinction between village industries and handicrafts is because fundamentally the handicraft economy has a role, especially in high-end consumption. It certainly adds a lot of value for the producer. But the fundamental objective that Gandhi and Kumarappa had was really asking the question, how do we allow the rural economy to retain the economic value of what it produces, right? So the question is, for example, if you look at, say, one of the things that they were very interested in that point was oilseeds, right? If you look at, for today, for example, cold press oil is the rage, right? You pay a premium. That was the standard default way of producing vegetable oil, edible oil, right? So the point is that when you do that for the urban market, you may want to ask, where is the economic profit going? That's obvious where it's going, right? It's going to the industries. But there's another corollary to this, which is actually missing in much of our discourse, is that what about, so this is the use and exchange value dimension in economics, right? What about the use value for the village? The best way to illustrate that, to my mind, maybe a little controversial, is to look at the experience of the dairy development in India, right? India was very deficient in milk, yeah, till this amazing Amul revolution took off. But one of the consequences of that is that people in the rural area cannot retain the nutritional value of the milk that they produce, because the money that they earn trumps that, right? And then there is a political problem of how price is controlled and so on and so forth. So we need not go into the historical village industries context, but if you really ask the question, should a farmer provide the milk of a couple of cattle that he or she may have to his to their own children, or should they sell it to the cooperative to make some money? So this is a big dilemma, right? There's a big problem there. So this is essentially the question, that where is the value? Value is not just in merely economic terms of the number of rupees it may command in the marketplace. Where is the value eventually going, right? And the reason the emphasis was really at that point, they were ambitious, but they started at a small scale, was to ask, how do we produce newer, modified technologies, I didn't have time to talk about that, which were affordable, but added value was sort of value addition that happened locally, so that the consumption also happens locally, right? So there is, so you're not really, because the moment you engage with the wider market, the differential of economic power is so high that it's invariable that things will fly out of the rural countryside, right? I'll just end with just one simple example. I mean, there has just been this whole history of Western countries trying to save Africa, right? I mean, throughout the years of aid that goes to Africa, essentially many billion, I don't remember the exact numbers, but actually if you really look at the net economic value of the produce that comes out of Africa that is consumed in Western Europe and in America is much more the price differential that is given, right? Yeah. So it's got to do with all of these kinds of unequal dynamics that are there built into the economy. So handicrafts it has a role, but you should not conflate the role of handicrafts, which is essentially of a very limited context in terms of its economic value that it can provide to a large number of people.
So the whole idea of value and moral is very critical in this postmodernist new economic thinking. And so it's to Sir actually. So you wrote an article about the economics of ahimsa, and you mentioned that this thinking was much more in the non-modern, where Gandhi is talking in Kumarappa, whereas it is not, we do not see it much in the postmodernist ideas. And second to you, ma'am, so in your book of Economics of Wellbeing, you mentioned cases of the new economy models, and one question was that in this whole model, can we say that the idea of local is also changes, because the local now is not only a geographical boundary, but so the whole idea is then when Gandhi is talking about local, I think he's talking about a certain geography, because he's also saying that how much things should travel or should not travel. So the whole concept of what it has an impact on ecology comes up, but it is not seen in the new economy model. How does that differ?
So I'm not sure I got the whole question, but it was about the fact-value separation, I think. Yeah. So I mean, as I think both Venu also mentioned this, I also mentioned it briefly. In the European context with the Enlightenment, you have the emergence of this idea that there's a separation between when you say value, we're basically referring to anything that is an ethical system of any kind, what ought to be the case and so forth. That it is possible to derive objective truth, and then later you come in with your ethical ideas and so forth. That's a modern notion in the sense that it emerges with the Enlightenment in Europe, which is not to say that it is there's no other ideas in Europe at the same time. There are of course other people who are disagreeing with that. But it is a convenient fiction. So this is, I think, the key point is that it is not it's a convenient fiction for capital to harness the power of science and grow and expand. So it is, we can all collectively pretend that that is the case, although everybody knows it's not the case. Gandhi is obviously, you know, in many contexts is the sort of emperor not wearing clothes kind of thing. You just need somebody to say, look, the emperor is not wearing clothes. And in this case also that's what he's doing. That it is not possible to separate these two things. There's always morality infused in everything. Niti vyapt is a kind of term that you use. The reality is niti vyapt. It is covered with these ethical considerations. There is no such escape from them anywhere. The postmodern connection I wouldn't go into here because there's a reaction that within Europe to this, which we need not go into. Gandhi is of course not responding to that either because he's before that.
I'm not sure, I'll try to answer. So the first thing is that yes, local is not to be understood in any fixed way. And there again I would build upon what both of them said about how do you read any historical figure, bear that in mind what they said. Today I would urge you to look at Ila Ben's book, Ila Bhatt, right, Anubandh, 100 Mile Communities. And the other, and that's by the way an idea that has been developed by many different kinds of formations. You may also want to look at the degrowth articulation. There's lots on it. If you just go to the group degrowth conference group that is there on the net. And another connected idea which is not there in Gandhi but it is implicit and it definitely is what will shape your lifetime, is whether local can be seen in the context of bioregions. Okay, so for example, if you live on the banks of the Brahmaputra, actually your local includes China. Because if tomorrow the Chinese decide to further dam their end of the Brahmaputra or they do further brutalization of the watersheds of the Brahmaputra, then it is very much going to affect the people who are living downstream. Okay, and in climate change is also changing. So it's not local, but it is a bioregional reality that by 2030, maybe 1/3 of Bangladesh is going to become uninhabitable. Either because of salination or actual, excess seawater climbing into fields and homes. And all those people will have to go somewhere. So I'm just urging that it's going to be a changing goalpost. What is local?
You said something, you talked about something about trusteeship in some ways being, in the future being a prospect. So what is your definition of trusteeship? Like in the institutional level or with the people, individual? Like what do you think it is, should be?
Yeah, so I'm reluctant to offer a very fixed definition, but here is one way of looking at it. First of all, that trusteeship deeply values the entrepreneurial skill. See, what happens is because we are critical of the way capitalism is operating, we think all entrepreneurial skill is capitalist. It's not. Entrepreneurship is a very old, all the craftspeople and the kind of economic realities that both Venu and Amit referred to, they require entrepreneurial energy. So number one is to appreciate that. Second, to know that everybody doesn't have that skill. So therefore, trusteeship is that those who have that special skill, which is, one is to be able to bring people and things together and produce new value, and the ability to take risk. Both these elements make up entrepreneurship. That those who have these abilities then have therefore a greater responsibility. Now this is a moral idea. Okay, that those who have this ability must therefore hold a greater responsibility to the society at large versus somebody whose skill is limited to maybe who only knows how to weave this. which is not a hierarchy necessarily, it's a gradation of ability.
So this is only related to skill or like opportunity or the way or the place you are born, like the privilege thing coming into hand?
Both. That is, of course, that would be actually that in any case is established from before. So this argument, when it's applied to the entrepreneur, is an extension of the pre-existing, what shall we say, not claim, but position or exhortation that to those to whom much is given, even more is demanded. Whether it is in terms of privilege of family background, the wealth, the connections, the resources that go with it, and therefore also your innate abilities which you are able to manifest.
Thank you.
And of course means. Nothing is more important than what Gandhiji calls sadhana shuddhi, purity of the means that you use to do anything. That of course applies to any kind of job or task, not just business.
About this fact that can we see Gandhian thought in the form of taming of capital? You know, this triple balance sheet business, and somehow people who have a lot will take care of the rest is an age-old idea which has failed miserably in our times, right? And can we attach that to Gandhian thought and say now corporates are realizing that they have to take care and so they are becoming Gandhian, is something that I find problematic. I would like to hear your views on that. Second is also this expansion of local to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is also local, right? I mean, so then you say whole world is local, and then so where does local stop and where does global begin, or whatever non-local begins? And if there is any kind of ideation of local, and if you want local, self-reliant, small, sustainable kind of an economy, these kinds of notions are also in schooling or education, which is my area of interest. People talk about small schools, people talk about local schools. How does one operationalize it? Right, therein lies the cracks. Have you seen interesting examples of operationalization of the local, which does all that, small, beautiful, self-reliant, you know, which can hold us as an example to follow?
Absolutely right. And if I gave the impression that there is some kind of imminent transformation of the business world, that is not at all what I am saying. So I withdraw that misunderstanding if I have created any. But the trends that I have spoken about are nevertheless significant to recognize that they exist. And that we are not in exactly the same place that we were, say, in 1970 when Reagan and Thatcher ran amok and said that no, there is nothing but market society. Kya hota hai? There is no society. The other thing is that there is a growing awareness, whether or not people as individuals are able to act on it, even powerful individuals, that the party is over. Communism self-destructed, but capitalism is bringing the species as a whole to self-destruction point, at least with life as we know it. Because there is now scientifically no doubt that on our current track, our species cannot get to 2050 without some form of massive dislocation in life as we know it today. I'm not saying the species will vanish, but we are really looking at a very severe dystopia, including possibility of mass death. And please remember, if James Lovelock's predictions come true,
of parsing of the underlying technological or the techniques, if you will, if you parse it out, then you sort of disaggregate them into asking questions, what should be local at what scale, if you will, right? Yeah, so of course that may be an incomplete answer in the sense that then we have to get into the actual specifics of each individual entities. It is not to argue that there cannot be anything that is central at all. Yeah, and I'll just quickly point out that here there is a whole question of what role the state has to play in all of this, right? And I think Gandhi and Kumarappa grappled with this question, and essentially their answer is incomplete. We have basically a sort of a love-hate relationship with the state, right? You need the state to do certain things for the public weal, but at the same time the state has enormous powers in the process, and that's liable to abuse. So, where do you stand with this question, right? And I think by and large the role of the state plays a very key, there's no getting away from that, right? And so that's a key player in all of these, a key actor in all of these kinds of discourses, and that needs to be sort of parsed